As the guests raised their glasses to celebrate Richard and Margaret's 20th anniversary, no one expected the night to end in scandal and suspicion. But when Margaret stepped forward, interrupting the toast with a chilling revelation about her husband's secret affair and the sudden suspicious disappearance of his lover, the party quickly twisted into something darker, leaving everyone questioning what they truly knew about the couple standing before them. Stay tuned as we unravel a story of hidden betrayals, dark secrets, and a shocking disappearance that will leave you questioning who can truly be trusted. The evening glowed with the warmth of celebration, casting a soft golden light over the elegantly decorated room. Family, friends, and colleagues filled the space, all gathered to mark a special occasion, the 20th anniversary of Richard and Margaret's marriage. Guests clinked glasses, sharing laughter and stories, enveloped in the joy of the moment. Margaret stood close to her husband, a soft smile on her face, but there was a subtle tension in her posture, something almost invisible to others who weren't looking closely. Her gaze occasionally wandered, lingering on her husband in a way that seemed both familiar and distant, as if she were watching him through a veil of memories and secrets. Richard moved through the crowd with ease, charming the guests, shaking hands and basking in the attention. Friends spoke of his dedication, his accomplishments, and the strength of his marriage, admiring Margaret's quiet, unwavering support by his side. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere felt warmer but also heavier, almost as if something unspoken was drifting in the air. Margaret held herself gracefully, her presence calm and composed, yet a flicker in her eyes hinted at something restrained, waiting just beneath the surface. Then, amid the friendly chatter, a longtime friend of Richard's made a light-hearted joke about the late nights Richard often spent with his secretary, Caroline. Laughter spread through the crowd, but Margaret's face momentarily tightened, her gaze sharp and dark as it fixed on her husband. The moment passed quickly, but it had left a tiny crack in the evening's pleasant facade. While others laughed off the comment, perhaps as a harmless jest, Margaret's reaction spoke of a different reality, a reality she had lived with, silently, for years. She turned slightly away, clutching her glass a little tighter, as if steadying herself against a wave of emotions that threatened to surface. As Richard lifted his glass to make a toast, Margaret's eyes remained fixed on him, her smile fading into something harder, more resolved. She stepped forward, her movement almost unnoticeable at first. Richard began his speech, thanking everyone for their support, their friendship, and their love. The words rang hollow to Margaret, their meaning lost under the weight of what she knew. She had been waiting patiently, enduring in silence for 2 long decades, watching as he kept up appearances, hiding his betrayal behind his charming smiles and friendly words. With a deep breath, Margaret took another step forward, interrupting Richard mid-sentence, her voice cutting through the laughter and chatter with a quiet strength that commanded attention. All eyes turned to her, surprised by this sudden break in the flow of the celebration. The room fell silent as Margaret's voice carried a gravity that demanded attention, a sound so out of place at a celebration, yet impossible to ignore. Richard's glass hovered mid-air, his expression shifting from confident warmth to a flicker of unease. The guests, caught off guard, exchanged uncertain glances, wondering if they were witnessing some unusual display of affection, an unexpected twist to an otherwise typical anniversary speech. Margaret held her gaze steady, refusing to look away from Richard's startled face. She took a small, deliberate breath, the kind one takes before a painful admission or an impossible truth. In the quiet that followed, her words were soft but firm, each syllable falling heavily, rippling across the room. "I'd like to say something," she began, her voice clear, yet carrying an undercurrent of tension that sharpened the room's atmosphere. Her eyes never left Richard, and for a brief moment There was a flash of something raw in her expression, hurt perhaps, or maybe a kind of dark satisfaction. 20 years is a long time, she said, her voice unwavering. Long enough to build a life together, and long enough to live with secrets. A murmur ran through the crowd as they listened, curious, confused, and on edge. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his confidence beginning to crack as he tried to respond, his smile weakening. But Margaret continued, her tone gathering intensity, growing louder, filling the space between them with an unmistakable tension. For years I trusted you, she said, her words measured, cutting deeper with each one. But that trust was a one-way street, wasn't it, Richard? The crowd held their breath, riveted, feeling as if they were trespassing on something intimate and forbidden. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Margaret's gaze grew harder, her voice lowering to a fierce whisper, though it reached every corner of the room. Did you think I didn't know? All those late nights, all the excuses. A silence fell, thick and suffocating, as guests began to piece together what she was saying. Richard's face paled, his carefully composed expression breaking down as he stammered, trying to speak, but Margaret pressed on, relentless, as if each word freed her from years of silent suffering. Yes, I know about Caroline, she announced finally, her voice raw with emotion. The name dropped like a stone, shattering the last bit of pretense in the room. Richard's friends and colleagues exchanged shocked glances, while others looked away, embarrassed by the deeply personal spectacle unfolding before them. Margaret's voice grew unsteady for the first time, but there was a strength behind it, a kind of cathartic release. I know what you've been doing, Richard, she continued, her voice cracking slightly as she went on, recounting the details she had uncovered over the years, the late-night calls, the whispered conversations, the trips that always had convenient excuses. She had pieced it all together slowly, carefully, and had endured it alone, waiting until this very moment. Richard remained frozen, his mouth slightly open, his face flushed with shock, and perhaps a hint of fear. He tried to raise his hands in defense, muttering denials that sounded weak even to him, but Margaret paid no mind to his hollow words. She seemed to have no interest in his response. This wasn't a dialogue, it was her reckoning. Then, just as the crowd began to absorb the impact of her words, Margaret shifted her gaze, as if searching for someone in the room. A murmur started to build as people realized what she was doing. They glanced around, scanning the faces, and it soon became clear. Caroline, Richard's secretary, and the subject of Margaret's painful revelation, was conspicuously absent. For someone so deeply tied to Richard, her lack of presence seemed odd, even disturbing. Whispers began to spread, subtle glances exchanged between friends who, up until now, had seen Caroline as nothing more than Richard's efficient assistant. Margaret's face softened slightly, her gaze distant, almost reflective, as if she were recalling something painful. I thought you should all know, she continued, her voice a touch softer now but still brimming with purpose. Caroline won't be joining us tonight. She's gone. Her words landed like a thunderclap, hanging in the air, leaving everyone stunned and paralyzed with horror. It was as though Margaret had spoken a curse, something too dark to contemplate. Guests exchanged alarmed looks, each wondering if they had misheard or misunderstood, but Margaret's expression was resolute, her gaze unyielding, making it painfully clear that this was no misunderstanding. People shifted uncomfortably, many now unable to meet her eyes, and the whispers grew louder, bordering on frantic. Had she meant that Caroline was simply absent? Or was there something more to her words, something more ominous? Richard looked as though he might faint, his face pale, his hands trembling as he struggled to comprehend the depth of Margaret's revelation. Margaret, however, seemed oddly calm, almost relieved, as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The guests, once relaxed and joyful, now felt trapped in a surreal nightmare, their minds racing to grasp the implications of Margaret's words. Every laugh, every shared memory, every pleasant interaction with Richard seemed tainted now, and the unease in the room was nearly tangible. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to drain the air, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Margaret stood calmly, her expression unreadable, a stark contrast to the panic and confusion that was beginning to spread. People were whispering now, leaning into each other, exchanging glances filled with unease. The name, Caroline, hung heavily in the air, and with Margaret's chilling declaration, "She's gone," no one knew what to think. The room, once alive with joy and laughter, now felt hollow, echoing with the dark reality Margaret had unleashed. Just then, the sound of sirens pierced the night, faint at first, but quickly growing louder until they were unmistakably close. Heads turned toward the doors as the murmurs grew louder. Margaret's eyes remained steady, her posture unchanging as the door opened, and two police officers stepped into the room. Their serious expressions did nothing to alleviate the growing sense of dread among the guests. The officers paused, surveying the scene, and after a brief exchange with the event's organizer, they walked directly toward Richard and Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson," one of the officers addressed Margaret, who nodded in acknowledgement. Richard looked between his wife and the officers, his face a mix of shock and fear. "And you must be Mr. Thompson," the officer continued, his voice neutral but carrying an unmistakable weight. Richard's hand shook as he raised it to greet the officer, but he quickly dropped it, his face contorted with confusion and dread. Guests around them recoiled slightly, creating a small circle of space, as if wary of getting too close to the unfolding scene. "We need to speak with you both," the officer said firmly, glancing at Margaret, who simply nodded and gestured to a quieter corner of the room. Richard, however, was visibly agitated. He looked from Margaret to the officers, stammering questions that came out incoherent, each word carrying the desperation of a man scrambling to hold on to the last shreds of normalcy. The officers guided Margaret and Richard to the side, but the guests remained glued to their spots, straining to hear, their curiosity overriding their discomfort. It didn't take long for them to learn the reason for the police's arrival. Quietly but clearly, the officers informed them that a body, believed to be Caroline's, had been discovered earlier that day under circumstances suggesting foul play. The revelation rippled through the crowd like a shockwave, filling the air with gasps and horrified murmurs. All eyes turned to Richard, some with pity, others with suspicion, and a few with thinly veiled disgust. Richard's face was ashen, his jaw slack, as he shook his head, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to protest. "I had nothing to do with this," he said, his voice shaking, nearly pleading. "I haven't seen her outside of work in weeks. She was just my secretary." But his protests sounded weak, the words hollow and unconvincing, even to those who wanted to believe him. Margaret, however, remained composed, watching him with a calmness that was almost eerie. The officers turned to Margaret, asking if she knew anything about Caroline's whereabouts or why she hadn't been at the event. Her response was cryptic, a careful balance of sorrow and resolution. "I knew she was involved with Richard," she admitted, her voice steady but carrying a weight that silenced the room. "I knew, and I was aware she had over time gathered information on Richard, on his business affairs." Her words painted a picture that suggested something far more complex than a simple affair. The officers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued. "Are you saying Caroline may have had information that could have put Mr. Thompson in a difficult position?" one officer asked cautiously. Margaret hesitated, her gaze drifting to the floor as though she was contemplating just how much to reveal. She finally lifted her head, meeting the officer's gaze with a piercing look. Caroline knew things that could ruin him, she said softly. She wasn't a woman who would keep quiet if she had something to gain by speaking out. The implication hung heavily in the air, casting Richard in a darker light. Had he been desperate enough to silence Caroline, or was Margaret somehow suggesting that Caroline's ambitions had led her down a dangerous path, a path that had ultimately led to her demise? The guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, each person's mind racing with new questions. As the weight of Margaret's words settled over the room, the officers turned back to Richard, their gazes scrutinizing him more closely now, as if assessing his every movement, every flicker of emotion. Richard's face had transformed from shock to a tense mix of anger and fear, his eyes darting between Margaret and the officers as though searching for an escape from the trap closing in around him. The guests, mesmerized and horrified, had shifted their attention entirely onto Richard, their expressions a mix of suspicion and morbid curiosity. Many were wondering the same thing. What was Margaret truly implying? And could it really be possible that someone in this room, someone they had known for years, was somehow involved in such a horrific act? The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating, until Richard, clearly struggling to maintain composure, broke it with a shaky attempt at self-defense. "Look," he began, his voice strained, barely concealing the desperation in his tone. "I had nothing to do with Caroline's death. Yes, we were close, but I would never hurt her. This is insane." He glanced around, hoping to find a sympathetic face, but the expressions staring back at him were anything but supportive. Friends who had laughed with him, who had trusted him, now looked at him with distrust, doubt filling their eyes. He could feel his world crumbling, the life he'd built slipping through his fingers. Margaret's expression remained unchanged, her eyes watching him with a strange calm, a quiet intensity that unnerved him more than anything else. She took a step forward, her voice low but piercing, addressing him directly as though no one else were in the room. "Did you really think you could get away with it, Richard?" she asked, her tone carrying an edge of scorn. "Did you think you could lie to me, deceive me, betray me for years, and that there would never be consequences?" Her words struck like a knife, each syllable dripping with years of pent-up resentment, anger, and the pain of betrayal. Richard's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration, his composure cracking as he turned to the officers in a last-ditch effort to defend himself. "This is ridiculous," he protested. She's angry because of what happened. But that doesn't mean I would—" His words trailed off, the implication too dark to finish. The officers exchanged a glance, noting his defensive stance, and turned to Margaret, asking her to clarify her knowledge of Richard's relationship with Caroline. Margaret didn't miss a beat. With a calm, almost detached tone, she described the pattern of late nights, the secret phone calls, the credit card receipts she had found tucked away, the notes in Caroline's handwriting that she had stumbled upon over the years. "I had my suspicions for a long time," she admitted, her voice firm. "But it wasn't until I saw them together, saw the way they looked at each other, that I knew." She took a shuddering breath, as if reliving the pain of that moment, though her gaze remained unwavering. The guests watched, riveted, as she recounted the moment she discovered the truth, each detail casting Richard in a darker, more sinister light. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and the officers leaned in, clearly intrigued by Margaret's revelations. Then, with a solemn expression, one of the officers asked the question that was hanging in everyone's mind. "Mrs. Thompson," he said carefully, "did you ever confront Caroline directly about this?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering, her eyes clouded with something that looked almost like regret. For a moment she seemed to waver, as if struggling with something deeply personal, before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she admitted, her tone laden with emotion. "A week ago, I confronted her. I wanted answers, closure, maybe some acknowledgement of the pain they'd both caused me." Her voice grew softer, yet each word seemed to strike with greater force. "I wanted her to understand the hurt she'd inflicted on our family, on our marriage, but she—" Margaret paused, a hint of bitterness creeping into her tone. She was unapologetic. She told me that Richard had promised her a future, that I was the obstacle in the way of their happiness. She didn't care about the damage she'd done. This confession seemed to send a fresh wave of shock through the room. Friends and family who had believed in the stability of Richard and Margaret's marriage now looked on with a mixture of pity and horror. The officers exchanged another glance, a silent understanding passing between them as they noted down every word. Then one of the officers spoke gently but firmly, probing deeper. "Mrs. Thompson, the day Caroline went missing, can you tell us where you were?" Margaret's eyes dropped to the floor for a moment, her fingers twisting together before she raised her head, her expression composed but weary. "I was here, preparing for this celebration. I wanted tonight to be perfect," she said, the irony of her words thick in the air. "After everything, I thought maybe we could find a way back, find some semblance of peace. I wanted to try." Her voice broke slightly, revealing the deep hurt she had concealed for so long, and the room fell silent, heavy with the weight of her words. But just as the crowd seemed to soften towards her, as if finally understanding the toll of her suffering, one of the officers, with a steady gaze, pulled out a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He held it up for Richard and Margaret to see, then unfolded it slowly, revealing a set of documents, emails and notes that had been recovered from Caroline's apartment. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his tone careful but relentless, "we found evidence that suggests you met with Caroline the night before she died. Her apartment's CCTV footage shows you entering her building." The crowd gasped, and all eyes snapped to Margaret, the previous sympathy now laced with suspicion. She stood still, her face paling as the evidence was revealed. For the first time, her composure cracked, her eyes widening in shock, her mouth opening slightly as if struggling for words. I wanted to talk to her one last time," she stammered, the calm that had carried her until now beginning to waver. "I thought maybe we could end things civilly. I didn't hurt her. I just needed to understand." The officer's gaze remained fixed, unwavering. "But, Mrs. Thompson, her doorman mentioned that he saw you leaving in a rush that night, visibly upset. And now, with Caroline gone, do you see how this looks?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, as the crowd collectively held its breath, each guest now questioning not only Richard's guilt, but Margaret's as well. The scene had transformed into something darker, an unimaginable horror that left everyone wondering if they had truly known either Richard or Margaret. Had Richard, desperate to keep his secrets hidden, taken drastic action to silence Caroline? Or had Margaret, after years of betrayal, taken matters into her own hands, exacting revenge in a moment of emotional collapse? The story had turned, twisting in ways no one could have predicted, and the once celebratory gathering now felt like the scene of a chilling, unresolved tragedy. A cold, uncomfortable silence gripped the room, and the guests, once so eager to celebrate, now stood transfixed, watching the dark drama unfold before them. Margaret's face remained pale, her carefully maintained composure finally fraying as she processed the accusation woven into the officer's words. For years, she had lived under the weight of her husband's betrayal, enduring humiliation, hiding her pain behind a polite facade, and tonight was supposed to be the night she reclaimed her dignity. But now, in an ironic twist of fate, she found herself the center of suspicion, her own integrity in question. The officer's gaze was unrelenting as he held the documents before her, each page representing a clue, a thread that tied her to Caroline's final days. The guests whispered in hushed tones, struggling to reconcile the image of Margaret as a loyal, patient wife with the implications of the evidence. It seemed unfathomable to them, yet every revelation tonight had proven that there was far more to this couple's story than anyone had imagined. Friends who had seen Margaret as the epitome of grace and quiet resilience now looked at her with wary, questioning eyes. In a desperate bid to defend herself, Margaret raised her chin, her voice trembling yet determined. "I admit that I went to see her," she said, her words carrying the raw honesty of a confession. "Yes, I confronted her that night, but it wasn't what you think. I was angry, hurt, but I wanted closure. I wanted to understand why she felt entitled to disrupt my life, my marriage." Her voice grew stronger, finding a rhythm as she spoke, as though her own conviction was giving her courage. "But I did not hurt her. I couldn't have, no matter how much pain she caused me." Richard, who had been standing silently in the background, suddenly stepped forward, his face twisted with desperation and perhaps even panic. "You're lying," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with venom. His words cut through the room, and for the first time his anger toward Margaret spilled out, unrestrained. "I know you, Margaret. I know what you're capable of. You've held on to this bitterness for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. I can see it in your eyes." His words were filled with contempt, each accusation sharper than the last. Margaret's face contorted in pain at his words, but her expression quickly hardened, her gaze turning cold and unyielding. "Capable," she echoed, her tone filled with disbelief and fury. "You're accusing me of bitterness, Richard? After everything you put me through? After all the lies, the nights I sat alone, the whispers behind my back?" She paused, her voice breaking slightly, though she forced herself to stay composed. "You were the one who betrayed me. You shattered our marriage, and now you're trying to make me responsible for your own sins." The guests watched in stunned silence as the couple's argument spiraled into a war of words, each trying to lay blame on the other. Old wounds, buried resentments, and long-held grievances surfaced, each accusation bringing a fresh wave of tension. It was as if a dam had burst, and years of suppressed emotions and silent suffering were finally unleashed in a torrent of anger and heartbreak. Friends who had once admired their marriage now stood in shock, wondering how they had never seen the fractures beneath the surface. The officers, sensing that their investigation was taking an unexpected turn, exchanged a look before intervening. One of them, trying to restore some semblance of order, gently but firmly reminded them both of the gravity of the situation. "We are here to understand what happened to Caroline," he said, his voice calm yet insistent. "We have reason to believe that both of you had motives, but we need facts, not accusations. Mrs. Thompson, if you have any additional information about your last meeting with Caroline, now is the time to share it." Margaret hesitated, her expression conflicted. She cast a quick glance at Richard, who looked away, his face twisted in anger and resentment. Taking a shaky breath, she continued, her voice subdued but steady. "When I met her that night, I asked her to end things with Richard, to leave us in peace. I tried to reason with her, but she laughed at me. She said she knew things about Richard that could ruin him, things that went far beyond our marriage. She said she had plans." Margaret's voice softened, tinged with sadness as she recalled the encounter. I didn't know what she meant, but she was determined, almost defiant. I realized then that she wasn't just after him, she wanted power over him. The guests, now captivated by every word, leaned in closer, realizing that Caroline's ambitions had run deeper than they had imagined. The officer narrowed his eyes, probing further. Did she say what kind of information she had on him? Margaret hesitated, glancing toward Richard, who was visibly tense, his jaw clenched as if bracing himself for a blow. She chose her words carefully, her gaze steady on the officer. She mentioned something about his business deals, unethical practices, things he'd hidden from everyone, including me. Richard flinched, his face growing paler, and the crowd shifted uncomfortably, many realizing they'd had no idea about Richard's double life. Some looked away, disturbed, as though unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the revelations now spilling into the open. Richard, feeling cornered, lashed out one last time, his voice strained. "She's lying," he said, though his words lacked conviction. I never did anything wrong. Caroline she was trying to manipulate me. And Margaret, you've hated her for years. You've wanted this moment, haven't you? You wanted her gone as much as I did." The words echoed through the room, hanging in the air like a dark, unspoken truth. The guests exchanged horrified glances, realizing that perhaps both Richard and Margaret had wanted Caroline out of their lives, albeit for different reasons. Each now seemed a suspect, each carrying a motive tied to betrayal, secrecy, and vengeance. The officers, piecing together the fractured puzzle of their statements, knew that the situation was murky at best. Then one officer leaned forward, pulling out another piece of evidence. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice low yet capturing everyone's attention. "We found fingerprints, yours, Mrs. Thompson, on the envelope containing documents that Caroline had prepared. She must have shown them to you the night you visited, correct?" Margaret's face drained of color, her hands trembling slightly as she nodded, unable to deny it. "Yes, she did," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "She wanted me to see them, to understand what she could do to him. She wanted me to feel the weight of the choice she was offering him, to be with her or to face ruin." Her voice faltered, and for a moment a glimmer of sorrow crossed her face. "I tried to take the documents, but she snatched them back, telling me that she alone controlled Richard's fate." The guests recoiled, each new detail painting a more complex and twisted picture. The room felt colder, as if even the walls were absorbing the layers of deception, greed, and bitterness that had festered for years. Richard looked as though he might collapse under the weight of his own lies, while Margaret, drained of her usual grace, appeared a shell of the woman they had once known. Each revelation had chipped away at their carefully maintained images, exposing the raw, ugly truth beneath. As the officers weighed the evidence, it was clear that neither Richard nor Margaret was innocent in the eyes of the crowd. Both seemed to have had reasons to want Caroline gone. Both had suffered under the twisted triangle that had haunted their lives, and both now bore the burden of suspicion. The room, once a space for celebration, now felt haunted, each person struggling with the knowledge that betrayal and deceit had walked among them all these years. The officers prepared to leave, promising further investigation, leaving the guests with a dark, unresolved reality. It was a night that had transformed everything they thought they knew about Richard and Margaret, each revelation leaving behind a deep, lasting scar that no one in the room would ever forget. As the officers left, the guests remained frozen in place, their faces pale and tense, each processing the shocking revelations that had shattered the evening's celebration. Whispers and fragmented conversations filled the room as friends and colleagues turned to one another, wondering aloud how they could have missed the dark secrets lurking beneath Richard and Margaret's marriage. The air was thick with unanswered questions, each one leaving a trail of doubt and suspicion that would linger long after the night was over. Margaret stood alone in the aftermath, her gaze distant, almost haunted. The weight of years, of betrayal, of secrets she had held in silence, pressed down upon her and for the first time that night, she looked vulnerable, worn. She had fought for so long, enduring Richard's infidelities and deceptions, hoping that one day perhaps he would change, or that she could find the strength to walk away. But now, any hope of redemption had been replaced by a dark, hollow emptiness. Richard, still reeling from the accusations and the harsh spotlight of the police investigation, looked defeated. His friends, who had once admired him for his charm and success, now avoided his gaze, their expressions filled with pity, disappointment, and barely concealed disgust. The man who had once commanded the respect and admiration of his circle now stood exposed, vulnerable, his once bright image tarnished beyond repair. Margaret took a deep breath, her face reflecting a strange mixture of sadness and release. She looked around the room, noting the way people watched her, their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. It dawned on her in that quiet moment that she was free. Free from the pretense of a perfect marriage, from the silent suffering she had endured, and perhaps from the last remnants of love she had once held for the man who had betrayed her. In a steady, composed voice that commanded attention, Margaret addressed the guests one final time. "You've all seen the truth tonight," she said, her tone resigned but resolute. "A truth I've lived with for years, hidden beneath a polite smile and a quiet heart. Perhaps it's fitting that it's finally out in the open, exposed for what it is. I've spent my life upholding an image, one that no longer holds any meaning." She paused, her gaze resting briefly on Richard, who looked away, his expression a mixture of shame and regret. This night was meant to celebrate a milestone, but it has become something else entirely. A reminder, perhaps, of the price we pay for deceit and betrayal, of the way secrets corrode and destroy, even when hidden in silence. Her voice softened, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "I've learned the hard way that some things cannot be forgiven." With those final words, she stepped away, moving through the crowd with a quiet dignity that belied the storm raging within her. The guests parted to let her pass, their faces reflecting a range of emotions: sympathy, respect, shock, and even a hint of fear. Margaret walked through them without looking back, her steps steady, each one distancing her from the life she had once shared with Richard, from the pain she had endured, and from the memories that would now haunt them both. As she left the room, Richard was left standing alone in the harsh light of his own unraveling. The guests, now drained of any desire to celebrate, began to disperse, their faces marked by a somber understanding that tonight they had witnessed something profound and tragic: the disintegration of trust, the destruction of a marriage, and the shadow of a possible crime that would never truly be resolved. The evening ended not with closure, but with an open wound, a lasting reminder that even the most carefully hidden secrets cannot stay buried forever. Each guest left with a heavy heart, knowing that the truth they had uncovered tonight would linger, a dark and haunting echo of the price one pays for betrayal. The unraveling of Richard and Margaret's lives serves as a haunting reminder of the profound consequences of betrayal and secrecy. Their story is a tragic illustration of how deception corrodes trust, slowly dismantling lives and relationships from within. For decades, Margaret held her silence, her quiet suffering masked behind a facade of loyalty. But beneath that silence, resentment and sorrow festered, leading to a reckoning that neither she nor Richard could escape. Ultimately, both became prisoners of the lies they had spun around each other, their marriage a hollow shell of what it once was, destroyed by choices they could never undo. As the evening ended, Margaret's final words lingered in the minds of those who had gathered, words that echoed a bitter truth about the human cost of deceit. The impact of this story reminds us of the need for honesty and integrity, even in the face of painful truths. Only in truth can we build relationships that withstand the tests of time and hardship. Lies may protect temporarily, but eventually they suffocate the very bond they were meant to preserve. If this story resonates with you, let it be a reminder to embrace honesty in your relationships. Confront your fears, address your secrets, and let trust be the foundation of every connection you build. After all, a life of truth may be challenging, but it is far less costly than the destruction left in the wake of betrayal.